Joelle, I'm sorry. Joelle, I apologize.
My name's Ray Collins. I understand why council proceeded with police contract negotiations last year in absence of a city manager, and I find no fault. The process did suffer from that decision made out of necessity. The assistant city managers did not understand that the process was going to be different with this first contract negotiated under the 10-1 council system, and thus did not communicate the new reality to their staff. I've read the draft resolution, item 47, and I support it because I view it as council's renewed effort to give policy direction for a better process than has occurred. Ryan McGivern recently provided me with an overview I had missed when he stood here at this podium and praised this council for seeking better processes. I likewise commend you in this specific matter before you today. Thank you.
Thank you, which we're going to fund anyhow. But as I listen to the conversation and as I watch what seems to be happening here, I think that we're trying to make a very strong statement to the public, and I think that is the overriding value of this. And at this point, I'm inclined to vote for this because I want to participate in this statement, even if it doesn't change anything that's going to happen here now. Because ultimately, when we actually change things will be when we approve a contract and when we approve a budget for 18-19 and when the chief knows how many people to put into the next cadet class that he's having. But if we're going to do that, then what I've handed out is the rest of the statement that I would like for us to be able to make, so that we're not making just a partial statement. And Mayor Pro Tem, this goes back to what you and I posted back in December, and conversations that I've heard all of us have on the dais, and that is there are several things that are interrelated here. How we have to decide how much we're going to pay our police officers. How much? Right now, they're paid 13% more than number 2. Where do we want to be? What's the appropriate place to be? But as we found out last December or November, whenever that was now, feels like 10 years ago, we can't make that decision unless we decide how many officers we're going to have, because those things are interrelated. We can't decide one question without knowing the impact on the budget and vice versa. So we have to make a decision about the appropriate staffing level in the city. And we have a disagreement with respect to how we do that. Even if we're in favor of community policing, some people say we should be picking up on efficiencies and not new officers, but that's a conversation we should have. I support community policing. I want to be able to make that statement. And I want to be able to say that it's important to have people that go into the community as officers that know the people they're seeing in the community. And it's important for when they go into a neighborhood that people in that community know the police officers that are coming into that community. Because it's about trust. We're one of the safest big cities in the country. We're ranked now number 4, number 5. That is a really good place to be. We have the lowest property crime rates that this city has had in 20 years. Now, violent crime has increased in the city. Most of that increase in violent crime is because of increased reporting of domestic violence claims. So I want to know what we should be doing with our police department to help us with the increase in domestic violence claims, because that is the increase, most of the increase we're seeing on violent crime in the city. But even with that, we're still in the top 5 safest cities in the country. So it's, again, a question of trust. So I would propose at some point to take the resolution as it's set, and also say, with respect to looking at the 5-year funding plan, let's take a look at that. Let's look at a community policing, and hearkening back, Councilmember Kitchen, to the budget rider that you put on the budget 2 years ago. How are we going to measure that effectiveness? Which goes to the testimony we had a moment ago. So I've put in here not to be prescriptive or to say it has to be these things, but these kinds of things. As the speaker said on this, how do we measure the efficacy, the effectiveness of community policing? How do we know that investment in that program is working? What kinds of things should we look at and measure? So that's in there. So it's the number of police officers, it's how much we pay the police officers, Councilmember Gassar has an amendment, which I'm going to support, that says let's also take a look at expenditures we could be making that will help us with public safety, that will help prevent crime rather than dealing with crime. And many of us have talked about mental health intervention and those kinds of things because that's part of the conversation. So I'm going to support your amendment when and if you make that. And then finally, we tied into the trust issue, because I think more than anything else, we're saying how do we do policing in this community so that we continue as a community to trust the folks that we have. We have to have a conversation about oversight. We have to look at evidence-based practices so that the conversation that we have actually tells us what we should or shouldn't be doing, so that we look at what we're already doing and make sure that we preserve all the things that we fought for over the last 20 years that are good. But if there are additional things we should take a look at those too. And we want to tie all these things up together somehow and literally imagine, just kind of dump it on your lap and say, figure out how it is we're supposed to get all these things to the same place at the same time, because we're not going to be able ultimately to decide any one of these without deciding them all. So that is what my amendment is intended to try to do.
There's been a tiny clarifying change to make sure that it's virtually the same thing as I handed out on Tuesday. I've just added additional language to make it clear that while this will be on a slower track than the staffing plan, that this is germane to the resolution and part of deciding how we fund the staffing plan. So my amendment reads, further be it resolved that as part of the police department staffing recommendations, the city manager should work across departments to provide recommendations to council on the best use of limited public safety dollars amongst various public safety investments that include, but not necessarily limit to, public safety personnel, targeted law enforcement programs, social services programs, and more. Some memo on the progress in May and further presentation when the budget's presented in August. And I apologize, printed out on.
To vote for. Mr. Flanagan?
I was more comfortable on Tuesday, but the more I thought about it, the more it seems to be the point of our strategic plan that we recently approved. And it's pretty clear from that process that it's not a couple of months of analysis. And so I'm not going to support this because I think having this analysis where we're cross-cutting all of our departments is the point of our larger strategic planning process and conversation, which is going to happen anyway, and we've already approved that. So I don't know that it's particularly necessary in this resolution because it is essentially what our strategic plan does.
And I'm a little mystified about kind of how we're approaching the contract negotiations at this point, because now we're adding values. Again, I support and will vote for all of the pieces that are really related to a contract and values that you're putting into this resolution, but I think we really need a clearer way to have this conversation. And so it's very clear that 5 of you are working together to provide our staff with elements that you would like to see in a contract. I think that we need, I agree with what Councilmember Poole and Councilmember Garza have said on the message board. I don't think, under city charter, our city manager is supposed to negotiate police contracts, and it is our job to provide the negotiating team with a clear sense of what we would like to see in that contract. And I think maybe the best path forward is to schedule some work session time, or if there are legal issues involved, schedule some executive session time so that we can be clear and talk together. I appreciate the 5 of you who are working together on those elements, but this is going to have to be a council decision, and we're going to have to speak with our negotiating team and with the public and try to get a path forward. So again, I'm supportive of having these elements in here. I just don't know that this is the right forum, resolution by resolution, to try to express what it is we want to see out of a police contract.
Mr. Mayor?
Any discussion before we do that? Mr. Flanagan?
I just feel compelled to kind of address what the Mayor Pro Tem laid out, and I think we are frustrated at how we are supposed to provide our direction on the contract negotiations. And I certainly heard legal advice that said that we couldn't do that but for being in a public meeting. And it's awkward to negotiate internally in a public meeting. And so 5 of us decided that, well, 5 people can talk, so we're going to figure out and find a way to come to some agreement, and I would assume that others are doing the same. Unless the legal advice changes on how we're allowed to do that, then that is the process that we're given. And I don't want to get to another contract that we, again, unanimously vote down because we weren't providing sufficient direction. And I don't know that we can provide sufficient direction in work session or public meetings or even in executive session because of advice we've been given in the past. And you know, we all have a responsibility to take leadership on this issue and to represent the issues of our constituents and to provide our new city manager with as much input as he can get so that the contract that we get next can be approved. And I'm sure that we all agree that we want to get to a contract that we can approve. We may disagree on the terms, but we have got to provide that direction to the city manager. And the advice that I've heard from our legal department is that it has to be done in sub-quorum out of public meetings.
So I would, and manager, I would ask you to get with our attorneys and get with the association and figure out how it is we can actually have a discussion about all these elements so that we can give direction and we can move forward, because by pieces like this, there's always going to be problems with this. That's the problem with having this piece come forward by itself the way that it did. Please figure out some way for us to be able to discuss this, deliberate on this, and give you direction, including analysis of what we're allowed to talk about and not talk about.
Was a send them back to the table. So this framing that contract was voted down is inaccurate. Second, this is such an inefficient process. I appreciate people respecting sub-quorum rules and saying we can only talk to each other, so that's what we're going to do. But that's not how this has been played out. We have started to get resolution and another resolution. Let's do a resolution next week that APD wears blue uniforms. Oh, they already do. Let's do a resolution next week that, there's cameras in the car. I mean, how many resolution after resolution are we going to have to give direction, to make it appear that we're moving towards a contract? Negotiations are dynamic. To expect our negotiating team to go office by office by office and hear that some group of 5 are getting information that other council members aren't getting information, that is inefficient. That is not the process that's before us. It's the city manager's job to negotiate the best contract that he thinks is good for the city, is good financially, is good for the police department, is good for everybody, considering all options, and then bring it back to the council. I understand I have more knowledge of this because of my experience as someone being at the table, but I really hope that we can get to a point where we do this the way it was supposed to be done. And it doesn't say that council members don't get to give input. It means that we do it efficiently so we can get to a contract, so we can be in a place where our police force doesn't think that their council doesn't support them. So I will say one more time, I did not vote down that contract. I voted to send it back to the table, and I hope we can get to a contract as soon as possible.